are a lot of great contenders for best storyline in wrestling history. Some might say it's the explosion of the Mega Powers, others might say it's Austin vs. McMahon, but in recent years, a new challenger to this crown has emerged. After all, it's largely been responsible for WWE's resurgence in popularity during the 2020s, and that's the story of the Bloodline. But how did it all happen? Well, join us as we take a deep dive into the entire tale right now. It all begins in 1914, as that's when Reverend Amatowanai Anoa'i, the patriarch of the Anoa'i family, was born. And over the years, a cavalcade of his kin would join the wrestling industry, with their ranks including legends like the Wild Samoans, Soulman Rocky Johnson, Yokozuna, The Rock, and Rikishi, just to name a few. That said, while the Anoa'i family were often acknowledged on WWE TV, the acknowledge of using their bloodline as an ongoing storyline was never really attempted until the mid-2010s, when Roman Reigns was on top of the company. Yes, it was at this point that after breaking off from The Shield, the big dog periodically began teaming up with his cousins Jimmy and Jey Uso. But even then, this was never a consistent stable. Rather, it was more something the trio did whenever they needed the extra bit of backup. So if that wasn't the official start of the Bloodline, when did it start? Well, to tell this, we have to flash forward a few years to 2020. That was the year when, with the world in shutdown, Roman Reigns was taken off of TV for health concerns and instead remained in isolation at home. Of course, this isolation was always going to be temporary though. The only thing which wasn't expected was that when he eventually did come back in the summer of this year, he'd have a whole new attitude. What was this new attitude? Well, now realizing how fragile and fleeting life could be, the big dog decided he needed to take charge of his family more thoroughly and make sure they were getting everything they needed. And in doing so, he developed something of a megalomaniacal streak, one so bad that he'd officially turned heel after siding with his new wise man Paul Heyman in the days leading up to Payback on August 30th. But then it wasn't like this heel turn ended up being a bad thing for him, because at Payback he'd defeat Bray Wyatt and Braun Strowman to win the Universal title. That's right, Roman was now the champ again, and this time, with an all-new character to sink his teeth into, he finally started to feel like the star people always knew he could be. But it wasn't just about winning the gold for the man now proclaiming himself to be the tribal chief. No, as we mentioned a moment ago, it was also about being a leader to his blood. And the first step in asserting that leadership was making sure his cousins the Usos were following him in this new path. Unfortunately for Reigns though, at least initially, Jey Uso didn't seem too receptive to his cousin's new attitude. And with Jimmy being out with injury at that point, it meant the leader of the Bloodline was a man without any soldiers. So, in order to resolve this issue, Roman had to show Jey who was boss, and the way he chose to do so was by taking him on one-on-one at September 27th's Clash of Champions. Who would come out on top here? The Tribal Chief, of course, with him winning after Jimmy Uso made a surprise return to throw in the towel for his twin brother after Jey had been on the receiving end of a punishing beatdown. So that was that then, right? Well, no, because even after such a brutal loss, Jey refused to bend the knee. In fact, he remained steadfast in his desire to take the Universal title away from his cousin, which was exactly why he challenged him to a rematch just 1 month later in an I Quit match at October 25th's Hell in a Cell. Of course, for as badly as Jey wanted to get the big win here and cement himself as a true main eventer, in the end such a result was not meant to be. No, instead what happened was, after Jimmy Uso once again got involved towards the close of the bout and got himself locked in a guillotine choke for his troubles, Jey was forced to say I quit so as to save his brother from further harm. And after that happened and the match was over, Roman simply walked up the entrance ramp where he was met by his uncle and father, Afa and Sika, two elders of the Anoa'i family, who proceeded to solidify his status as the new head of the table by adorning him with a ceremonial ula fala. The only question left to be answered now then was, after being beaten twice, would Jey Uso finally acknowledge his tribal chief? Yes, was the answer to that. And so, with this now settled, the hierarchy of the Bloodline began to appear, with it at this point seeing Roman serve as their leader, Paul Heyman serve as consigliere, and Jey serve as the attack dog who was often sent to soften up whoever his boss's next opponent was ahead of time. Who was that next opponent as 2020 gave way to 2021? Well, that would be Kevin Owens. But for as great as KO was, there was no way he was ever going to overcome the might of this new all-powerful heel stable. And the next challengers didn't fare much better either, because with Jey Uso always there to lend a helping hand, and with Paul Heyman always there to call the plays from a distance, the Tribal Chief was able to walk in and out of WrestleMania season, still the Universal Champion after an absolutely dominating performance saw him beat both Edge and Daniel Bryan at WrestleMania 36. And he wasn't the only one enjoying success then, as with his cousin there to guide him, Jey Uso was able to get a big win during the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal on the April 9th episode of SmackDown too. One Uso who was not on board with the whole bloodline yet though was Jimmy. And that became clear when he returned on May 7th and began berating his brother for being Roman's lackey. So realizing he had to assert his dominance again, the head of the table was able to manipulate things so that, after Jey briefly walked away from the group due to the tension between Roman and Jimmy, Jimmy was guilted into siding with the champ. And this in turn ended up bringing Jey back into the fold too, as for the first time, the Bloodline truly felt like a unified front. And with that mountain finally having been conquered, the next step in their reign of dominance was for the Usos to win some gold of their own. So that's exactly what they do when on July 18th, 2021 at Money in the Bank, while the head of the table was successfully defending his Universal title against Edge once more in the main event, the Usos would be beating Rey and Dominic Mysterio during the pre-show to become SmackDown Tag Team Champions. Really, by now, it felt like there was truly nothing that could stop the Bloodline. Hell, even when John Cena made a return to challenge Reigns at SummerSlam, it would do no good because the champ had by now leveled up so much, even the former face of the company couldn't hold a candle to him anymore. And this pattern would continue on as 2022 dawned too, though by that point the first cracks in the veneer began to show for the Bloodline, as it was in January 29th's Royal Rumble pay-per-view that Roman lost to Seth Rollins, albeit by disqualification, meaning the Universal title didn't change hands. And that wasn't the only problem the Bloodline were having by now. No, there were also issues with Paul Heyman, as after Brock Lesnar returned to WWE in late 2021, Roman Reigns began to become suspicious as to where his wise man's true allegiances lay. Thankfully for the heel group though, any speculation about loyalties were put to rest when at the Royal Rumble, Reigns returned later on in the evening following his own match to lay out Lesnar with a belt shot, all as the former ECW boss stood in his corner and confirmed he was indeed still on his side. So this started the build towards a Reigns vs Lesnar match at WrestleMania 38, where both Roman's Universal title and Brock's WWE title would be on the line, winner takes all. And as WrestleMania closed out that evening, the Tribal Chief was standing tall as undisputed WWE Universal Champion, with his undisputed title run at this point being 581 days long. And Roman wouldn't be the only member of the Bloodline who'd be a double champion by the time the summer came around. No, after successfully defending their SmackDown Tag Team titles at WrestleMania 2, the Usos would go on to unify them with the Raw Tag Team titles when they beat RK Bro on the May 20th episode of SmackDown, with this victory pretty much making the group the most dominating stable WWE had seen in decades, maybe ever. Little did we know though, things were only just getting started and would get even better, because it was in the summer of 2022 that things went from great to all-time legendary when Sami Zayn started interacting with the group. At first, it was only supposed to be comedy segments for a couple of weeks. Mid-card heel Sami Zayn delusionally tries to get the help of Roman Reigns so that he can best his own opponents with greater ease. But as time went on, it became clear WWE had something special on their hands with this one, as Sami proved to be so lovable in his role of delusional heel, so naive in his belief that the Bloodline would accept him into their family, he was pretty much turned babyface by audiences everywhere. Sure, he would still technically be a heel, as would the rest of the Bloodline, but every time the Quebec native featured in a segment with the Usos, trying desperately to get an audience with the champ, it was impossible not to be endeared by him. And these feelings only got more intense once Sami actually started appearing in segments with Roman himself, as they had an instant chemistry together. But even if Zayn was slowly starting to grow on most of his newfound family, one person who was absolutely not buying what he was selling was Jey Uso. No, by the time the autumn was dawning, he seemed to be the lone holdout in welcoming the newcomer to the group with open arms. Well, sort of open arms, because in truth, Sami wasn't a full-blown member of the Bloodline yet. Rather, he was an honorary Us, with this being a title he had first suggested for himself a few months earlier in the alliance. And this status as honorary Us was confirmed when, much to the chagrin of Jey, Roman gave a new t-shirt to his disciple emblazoned with this moniker. What was happening with the world title and the tag team titles while all that was going on? The same as had been happening to them in the months and years prior, because at SummerSlam both Reigns and the Usos successfully defended their respective gold, and at Clash at the Castle a few weeks later, the Tribal Chief would do the same again against his toughest challenger to date, Drew McIntyre. And the reason this was Roman's toughest challenger yet was because this event took place in Drew's native UK, with the crowd cheering him on towards victory every step of the way. Sadly for the Scottish psychopath, however, his attempts to get a victorious moment on his home turf were spoiled when, towards the close of the bout, an all-new member of the Bloodline appeared and helped his leader to earn a victory. Who was this new member? Why, that would be Solo Sikoa. Yes, unbeknownst to the rest of the group, it appeared that the elders of the NOIE tribe had sent Solo to act as a new silent heavy for the Bloodline, and this was a role he would serve going forward then, even if his tribal chief was a little unsure of him at first. And then there was Sami Zayn, outcast of the whole situation, someone who was still desperately trying to become a fully blown member of the stable. What Sami really needed then was something which would truly prove his loyalty to the group. And luckily for him, he'd get this at Survivor Series on November 26th, as there, he'd be part of Team Bloodline during the War Games match, where they went up against the babyface collective of Drew McIntyre, Sheamus, Butch, Ridge Holland, and Kevin Owens. Would Sami side with Roman and company over his real-life best friend KO here? That was the question everyone was looking for an answer to. And it was a question they ultimately got an answer to when, towards the close of the bout, Zayn proved his loyalty to the Bloodline by delivering a low blow to Owens, a low blow which directly led to him getting pinned by Jey Uso. And so, just like that then, Sami Zayn now felt like a fully accepted member of the heel stable for the first time. Hell, even Jey seemed to have fallen in love with him by now. But alas, if anyone was thinking it was going to be happy times from here on in, they'd be wrong, because after Sami and Roman lost a tag team bout to Kevin Owens and John Cena on the December 30th, 2022 episode of SmackDown, cracks would once again begin to form in that trust between the Canadian and the rest of his new family. And this would ultimately lead to the trial of Sami Zayn being carried out by the Bloodline on the Raw before the 2023 Royal Rumble. But even if Sami had escaped the chopping block here, he still had one more test to pass, and that test would happen at the Royal Rumble just 6 days later. That was the night where, after once again successfully defending his undisputed WWE Universal title against Kevin Owens, the Bloodline began laying into the babyface during a post-match beatdown. Well, we say all the Bloodline joined in here, but what we really mean is all of the Bloodline except for Sami Zayn. Yes, Sami was finally starting to realize that Roman was just using him like any bully would, and that was why, to the sounds of a catastrophic pop from the live crowd, he instead clattered the head of the table with the chair, laying him out. Yes, Sami Zayn had made his choice, and in the process, had turned babyface once more. And this could only mean one thing: a big-time showdown between him and the champ 1 month later at Elimination Chamber. But what made this match so special wasn't just the fact that it was Zayn versus Reigns, one of the most anticipated bouts WWE had put out in years at that point, and the match which, at the time, felt like it really could be the climax to the whole Bloodline story. No, it was also the fact that it was taking place in the challenger's own hometown of Montreal. But in the end, even having the support of an entire city wasn't enough for Zayn to walk out champion. No, after the entire Bloodline, including a still conflicted Jey Uso, got involved to interfere towards the close of the bout, Roman would be able to hit a spear and get the 1-2-3. But there was another big challenger waiting in the wings, the man who had won the Royal Rumble 1 month previously, Cody Rhodes. Yes, rejoining WWE the prior year, Cody had been on quite a tear, with his momentum building up so much by now that he was equally as over as Sami Zayn. So if Sami wasn't going to be the one to dethrone Roman then, it felt like Cody was the only other option left. And that would be the story heading into the main event of WrestleMania 39. Or rather, it would be one of the stories for one of the main events, because with this being after the point WWE had decided to extend WrestleMania to 2 nights, it meant that there was going to have to be a big-time closer for night 1 as well. And WWE had a major match to fill this role, with that being the Usos defending their undisputed tag team titles against the now reunited Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens. So all the pieces were set for the dramatic conclusion of the Bloodline storyline then. But while night 1 would end with a feel-good moment of Sami and KO dethroning the Usos as undisputed tag team champions, night 2 would not be such a fairy tale. That's right, Cody had failed, and the Tribal Chief had won again, with his title reign now reaching 945 days in length. What did this mean for the future? Well, for Cody, it meant leaving the title picture behind for a while and beginning the process of building himself back up again. For Roman Reigns, meanwhile, it meant taking a sabbatical from the ring for a few weeks, and as far as the Usos were concerned, well, they weren't quite done yet with Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens. No, they'd continue to be a thorn in the side of the new undisputed tag team champions, with this being exactly what led to them partnering up with Solo Sikoa to continue going after them over the next few months. And that wasn't the only battle Jimmy, Jay, and Solo were involved in at this point. No, on the orders of the tribal chief, the other three members of the Bloodline would also form something of an uneasy alliance with the Judgment Day over on Raw for a while, as both sides began to develop a common interest in destroying the Latino World Order. Of course, all this was just a placeholder for what fans really wanted to see though, and that was the return of the undisputed WWE Universal Champion. When would this come? Well, that wouldn't be until May, by which point dissension was once again beginning to sow itself within the ranks of the Bloodline as Jimmy Uso started growing more and more frustrated with still being seen as a lackey. And this would all come to a head at Night of Champions, as that was the evening where, while challenging Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn for the undisputed tag team titles, Roman Reigns and Solo Sikoa ate an embarrassing loss when Jimmy turned on them and left the family behind. Yes, Sami may not have been the one to dethrone Roman, but at least he was now able to look on as the Bloodline began to implode fully. The only question at this point was what side would Jay choose, his brothers or his cousins? Well, the answer to that question would come on the June 16th episode of SmackDown, as that was when Jay reunited with Jimmy and challenged Roman and Solo to a tag team match at July 1st's Money in the Bank pay-per-view. And this one ended in a way which surprised many because rather than this represent another win for the head of the table, it would actually mark his first pinfall loss since December 19th of 2019, a full 1,290 days prior. Who would be the one to beat Roman here? That would be Jey Uso, the man who challenged him for his Universal title back when he'd first won it in 2020. And because he got the win here, this meant he'd have another title shot coming up in the very near future, at SummerSlam to be exact. But this match wouldn't just be for the gold. No, with it later being determined that it would be a tribal combat match, it meant it would also be for the role of tribal chief itself. So the stakes couldn't have felt any higher if they'd tried. The only question was, would Jay finally be able to live up to the moniker of Main Event Jey Uso and beat his cousin, in the process ending his 1,070-day-long run as champion? No, was the answer to that. Rather, this one would prove that Roman's loss at Money in the Bank had only been a blip in the road, with the win ultimately coming for him at SummerSlam when Jimmy Uso screwed over his own brother and rejoined the Bloodline. And after this, things would fracture out across brands, as on the next episode of SmackDown, Jay would quit the show and move over to Raw instead. With it being there, he finally had a chance to face the consequences of his past actions. Yes, despite him now being a babyface, many on the Raw roster were not too happy to see Jay, and the biggest of these was Drew McIntyre, the man who had notably been screwed out of winning the world title from Roman Reigns at Clash at the Castle in September of 2022. The only friends Jay seemed to have at all, in fact, were Sami Zayn and Cody Rhodes, with it being the latter he briefly won the tag titles with during the autumn of that year. As for Jimmy Uso, well, after explaining that he'd screwed his brother out of the undisputed WWE Universal title as he didn't want to see it corrupt him like it had Roman, he'd returned to being a lackey of the Bloodline, with him now being very clearly outranked by Solo Sikoa in the pecking order. And this was the way things would remain for the next few months, with everyone once again killing time for a while until Roman Reigns returned from his sabbatical. What would Roman do once he finally did return to the ring? Well, after beating LA Knight at November 4th's Crown Jewel, he'd ready himself for more new challengers in the form of Randy Orton and LA Knight. And while he was doing this, he was also taking the time to reward Solo Sikoa for all his hard work by anointing him the new tribal heir of the Bloodline. And it's just as well he did this because with Solo now more loyal than ever and more determined than he had been before to help keep the undisputed WWE Universal title around his tribal chief's waist, Reigns would be able to walk out of a four-way match at the Royal Rumble, pitting him against Knight, Orton, and AJ Styles, still the champion. But while on most nights this might have been a cause for celebration in the Bloodline, by the time the event was over, there were no such parties happening. And that was because in the Rumble match itself, Roman's WrestleMania 40 challenger was seemingly determined when Cody Rhodes won for the second year in a row. However, a spanner was thrown into the works when, on the February 2nd episode of SmackDown, Cody came out to confront the head of the table and tell him that, well, yes, he would be coming for his title, it wouldn't be at WrestleMania. No, instead, the man who was now seemingly going to be facing Roman for the gold at the Showcase of the Immortals was going to be Roman's cousin, The Rock. Needless to say then, despite Rock and Roman being a match which had been teased for years by this point, fans were not happy with this new turn of events, and this all led to quite the backlash as the days went on, making WWE change plans and reverse the decision, once again making it Roman versus Cody for the undisputed WWE Universal title on the grandest stage of them all. So what happened here? Well, it appears that Dwayne Johnson was informed that the WrestleMania main event would be between him and Roman Reigns. The only problem was that this was at odds with the storyline Triple H had been telling for a year by then, that being Cody Rhodes finishing the story. So it was then that the game booked Cody to win the Royal Rumble anyway, and then the next week on TV he had him come out looking noticeably drained as he gave away his world title shot to the People's Champion. Yes, it's not hard to see how audiences were primed to dislike this move. And to The Rock's credit, once he realized his original plan wasn't working, he pivoted away from it. But what would The Rock's new role be now that he was no longer the returning babyface coming to wrestle away control of the Bloodline from his cousin? Well, that would be the uber heel final boss, the guy who was literally in control of the whole show and who could do as he pleased, when he pleased, swear jar be damned. And the next chapter in the angle would be written at Elimination Chamber on February 24th. That was where Cody Rhodes appeared in the ring with a man who at one point looked like he was going to be his replacement opponent at WrestleMania, World Heavyweight Champion Seth Rollins, and there offered him a chance of a lifetime. Main event night 1 of the Showcase of the Immortals with him in the biggest tag team match in WWE history. That's right, night 1 was now going to be Cody and Seth versus Roman and The Rock, with the stipulation being that if the babyfaces won, then the rest of the Bloodline would be banned from ringside for Cody versus Roman on night 2. If, however, The Rock and Roman were able to get the win during the first night, then night 2 would be Bloodline rules. So like that, a year after WrestleMania 39, the stage was finally set for Cody to make right his prior mistake and for the Bloodline angle to finally reach its apex. And boy, were fans into this one, because in the weeks leading up to the show, arenas would be selling out left, right, and center as audiences everywhere were desperate to get in on the fun. Of course, for as much fun as it all was though, there was still a lingering fear in the back of fans' minds that if Cody had lost the year before, what was going to stop him from losing again? And those fears were only added to when, on night 1 of WrestleMania, Roman and The Rock were able to get a win over Cody and Seth, with this meaning the night 2 main event would indeed be Bloodline rules. Of course, that's not the only big Bloodline moment which happened on night 1 though. No, elsewhere on the undercard we would also get to see the Usos have their first one-on-one singles match together. Yes, after Jimmy, now fully brainwashed by Roman Reigns again, had screwed Jay during an Intercontinental title match against Gunther during the lead-up to WrestleMania, Jay had decided enough was enough and that he needed to rid himself of this part of his life once and for all. And so it was then that the two collided on April 6th in a match that tied up part of the story and allowed Jay to get the big babyface win. Once that was over though, it was on to the big finale, the main event of WrestleMania 40 Night 2, pitting Roman Reigns against Cody Rhodes with the undisputed WWE Universal title on the line, Bloodline rules. How would this one go? Well, in what has since been described as WWE's version of Avengers Endgame, the whole thing would go excitement to the max in the best possible way. That's right, after appearances from the Usos, Solo Sikoa, John Cena, The Rock, Seth Rollins, and even The Undertaker himself, we were down to 2 again, with Cody now finally having an even playing field against Roman Reigns. And because he now had an even playing field, at just over 33 minutes in, the American Nightmare was able to hit the head of the table with 3 consecutive crossroads after Roman became too distracted with attacking his old Shield mate with a steel chair, with this allowing Rhodes to get the 1, 2, 3. Yes, after 1,316 days, the reign of the Tribal Chief was over. And while this isn't the end of the Bloodline story, it can be considered the end of the first major arc, as since this point, a whole new bloodline has been formed with Solo Sikoa now acting as the Tribal Chief, while Roman Reigns, the Usos, and Sami Zayn have reunited to wage war against them. So, we'll all have to stay tuned to see how the rest of this great story unfolds, and we'll be sure to be back with a part 2 to tell the tale of how it all goes down.